Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Dr. Michael New. And today we're going to be talking about the FDA's new approval of Opill and then why the data shows that contraception doesn't actually decrease abortion rates. So, yeah, I believe that when the FDA approved Opill, they said that it would decrease unwanted pregnancies. Is that what
Mhm.
you originally began writing about this issue in response to?
Yes, that there's lots of concerns about Opill. I mean, there's some health consequences that women with breast cancer, women with liver disease shouldn't take it. Additionally, it can cause side effects like cysts and abnormal bleeding and depression, which is an issue among young women. But my main concern really is that it's just not going to deliver. That it's actually not going to reduce either unintended pregnancies or abortion. And what the data does show from a lot of studies in a lot of different countries is that just expanding access to contraception has always been a poor strategy for reducing either unintended pregnancies or abortion. I think it's either going to be ineffective at best or counterproductive at worst.
Yeah. And I mean, that's something that we've talked about in theory on the show before. We've talked about the idea that when you think about what leads to abortion, it's this contraceptive mindset. And we have a whole ebook on the subject. You mentioned that there's some studies in different countries about that. Can you just talk a little bit about what those specific studies show?
I mean, sure, there's a lot of research I could talk about. I mean, the most important talking point I have is that plain, pure, and simple, contraception is a failure rate. Uh, Guttmacher, which up until 2006, 2007 was Planned Parenthood's research arm. They are very pro contraception, but even their research shows that half the women seeking abortions were using some kind of contraceptive the month they conceived. So there is a failure rate, and this Opill, which was just approved by the FDA, has a failure rate. It's actually has a higher failure rate than hormonal contraceptives that have to be approved or prescribed by physicians. And what it makes it even worse is that the failure rate goes up when it's not properly used. And I think that Opill will be used by a lot of teenagers, a lot of young women who want to either conceal their pregnancy or I should say, want to conceal their sexual activity, from their parents or from medical professionals, and they won't use it every day. So we really see failure rates go up quite a lot. When contraceptives aren't used properly, and when you multiply that among more sexually active women, engaging in more sexual activity, you're going to see again more unintended pregnancies, more abortions. So my one talking point, is contraception has a substantial failure rate. Another talking point that I think is important is that there's not some massive contraception access problem in this country. Guttmacher, again, back I guess around 2002, did a study of about 10,000 women who had abortions. And they asked women who weren't contracepting, why? Why didn't you use a contraceptive? Only 12% cited either cost or availability. Most of the women who weren't using contraception just said they wanted to show trust in a partner. They didn't think they'd get pregnant. They were willing to run the risk of getting pregnant, but cost or availability, was not a factor. Cost or availability was a factor in a relatively small percentage of instances. Again, 2012, the CDC did a study. They looked at 5,000 teenage girls who gave birth. Again, they asked those girls why weren't using a contraceptive. Again, a small percentage say cost or availability. So most women who want to obtain contraceptives or use contraceptives can get them. Very few women who aren't using them say either cost or availability as the reason why.
Very few people say that. Okay. And
Yeah.
what makes Opill different than the other birth control pills that are out there? Is there
Well,
anything?
what makes Opill different is it can be acquired over the counter. For most forms of hormonal contraceptive, a woman needs a prescription from a doctor, and that's good public health. I mean, there are some women who should not be taking contraceptives for health reasons. Women with breast cancer, women with liver disease, and a health professional, will be able to advise them, properly on that. With Opill, it's just going to be available over the counter. It can be bought in supermarkets, in convenience stores, even in pharmacies. So again, it's going to make it more available, I think, especially to teenagers, to young women who are trying to conceal their sexual activity from either their parents or healthcare professionals. And again, I think there's a good chance that they won't be aware of the side effects, that they won't use consistently. It'll encourage or enable sexual activity. And again, the end result will probably be more unintended pregnancies and more abortions.
Okay. And then you wrote an article about this for the Washington Exam or National Review. And then someone in the Washington Examiner, I believe her name was Tiana Lowe Dosher, picked it up and wrote in response to you. And so she was critiquing the data that you were citing in your article. And I believe it seemed like her main talking point seemed to be that the studies about contraception also include things like condoms that have very high failure rates. Can you just talk a little bit about what she was actually critiquing and if it's actually if it actually does contradict what the original article said, or if her data was not being used in a looked at in a proper way?
Well, I appreciate, her diplomatic tone and their willingness to engage some studies of mine. She made some different points that I don't think were really well documented. I mean, one thing I'm not sure if she brought this up is that people claim that more contraceptive use has gotten the abortion rate down. That's really not the case. We've seen more contraception use in this country since the early '80s, but unintended pregnancy rates have fluctuated. What has gotten abortion numbers down is that a higher percentage of unintended pregnancies are in fact carried to term. That's, I think, because of the good work of pro-lifers in terms of our education efforts, our service efforts, our legislative efforts. And that's why the U.S. abortion rate's fallen by more than 50% since 1980. Dozier also claims that, even though there are women who may not cite cost or availability is the main reason. Cost or availability might be a reason. They aren't using contraception. But I think that she doesn't really look at the data the right way. This Guttmacher study allowed people to cite multiple reasons why they weren't using contraception. And I think she tallies up these reasons or the percentages and comes up with a very high figure, but she shouldn't tally them up because, again, people can cite multiple reasons why they weren't using contraception. So I think that was a mistake on her end. And she also talks about, failure rates. And again, when used properly, Opill would have a pretty low failure rate. But again, you have to look at who's going to be using Opill. And I think Opill is going to be attractive to teenagers, young women, again, trying to conceal sexual activity from either their parents or from healthcare professionals. We just know for a fact that young people are just not as diligent about using contraception, as their older counterparts. I mean, Opill has to be taken every day at about the same time. People are human. They make mistakes. I would say teenagers probably make mistakes more than women who are a little bit older. So again, if you have teenagers using this, but they aren't taking the proper dose every day and they're sexually active, that failure rate goes up. It goes up a lot. And as I said, I think that's going to result, again, sadly, more unintended pregnancies and more abortions.
So basically, would you say that the data shows that as women use contraception, they're more likely to engage in sexual activity, which is going to drive up the abortion rate? Is that a pretty good summary of what the data shows about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even Guttmacher's data from the 1960s shows when oral contraceptives became available. Again, teenagers were more likely to engage in sexual activity as a result. And the availability of oral contraceptives have had negative impacts kind of elsewhere. I mean, I think that, for instance, prior to the early 1960s, men faced a lot more social pressure to marry women they impregnated. In the 1950s, if you were a guy and you got a woman pregnant, you married her. If you walked away from a woman you impregnated, you were allowed. Nobody would have anything to do with you. After the advent of oral contraception, that changed. It became a lot more easier for men to simply walk away from women they impregnated. And, the end result, sadly, was in some cases more abortions, and in some cases, more women having to raise children without the benefit of a father in that child's life.
Why
So,
would
and
that,
there's other.
oh, sorry. Why would the advent of contraception lead to men being able to walk away? Because it seems like if a woman gets pregnant, no matter, even if she's been using contraception, she's still pregnant. And why would that change that situation?
Well, it just changes the dynamic because essentially, men view avoiding pregnancy as a responsibility of the woman. The woman has to obtain the oral contraceptive. The woman has to take the oral contraceptive, and essentially that it becomes all of a sudden the woman's responsibility to avoid the pregnancy. So men have this mindset that they can simply engage in sexual activity without consequence, and when there are consequences, namely a pregnancy, they don't feel it's really their responsibility. So when contraception becomes kind of a woman's responsibility to both acquire and take birth controls, consistently, and a pregnancy happens either because of incorrect use or just because of the failure rate, again, it's just much easier for men to effectively blame that on the woman and walk away.
Interesting. I never actually thought of it from that perspective before. Obviously I've thought about how contraception leads to more abortions because of you're instilling this idea that you should be avoiding children when you have sex. But I've never actually thought about how it's going to put the burden in quotes, I guess, of not having a child on the woman instead of on both of the partners, only having sex, obviously, if they're married or in the context of wanting to have children. So that's an interesting observation of how it would affect it. You also brought up emergency contraception in your article. Can you speak to why studies on emergency contraception are relevant in a discussion of the Opill and how increased access to emergency contraception doesn't actually, again, decrease surgical abortion rates, because obviously emergency contraception and most hormonal contraception is an abortifacient. But like that aspect aside, why it doesn't decrease surgical abortion rates.
Yeah, sure. I mean, emergency contraception is relatively new, and we've been able to run controlled studies of places where it's available. There have been 23 studies between 1998 and 2006, and they all show that greater access to emergency contraception does not reduce pregnancy rates, unintended pregnancy rates, or abortion rates. There have been specific studies looking at places like Shanghai, San Francisco, Scotland, where it was made available or it was subsidized in certain ways. And again, the research is pretty clear that making emergency contraception more available just doesn't reduce either unintended pregnancy rates or abortion rates. And again, it's kind of the same dynamic in play. I think it does encourage sexual activity. I think it results in more kind of overall pregnancies. I think it does make it easier for men to walk away from the women they impregnate. And again, the end result is higher rates of unintended pregnancy and more abortions.
Okay. And then I had a question that I think you basically answered already, but in your article, you had mentioned that contraception use has increased since 1980, but the abortion rate has decreased since 1980. And you were saying that the reason that the abortion rate has decreased is because of increased pro-life efforts, not because of the increased contraception use. Those would seem to contradict each other. So, but the question that you were addressing was the unwanted pregnancies. So there must be different data that they track that shows that has the unwanted pregnancies has fluctuated even as contraception use goes up and the abortion rate goes down. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, Guttmacher does track unintended pregnancy rates.
Okay.
And one thing we've seen is that they've fluctuated. You've seen a very durable decline in the abortion rate since 1980 and 2017. I mean, a couple hiccups, but it's basically been almost a downward linear trend. When it comes to unintended pregnancies, there's been fluctuation. We actually saw the unintended pregnancy rate increase between 2001 and 2008, according to Guttmacher data. So you've not seen a consistent, durable decline in the unintended pregnancy rate, even though contraception use has increased. And it's increased among kind of different kinds of contraceptives, whether it's the pill, whether it's kind of injectables. There's been, a lot of research showing that, contraception use has gone up since the early 80s, but you've not seen, a consistent, durable decline in the unintended pregnancy rate. One thing you have seen is an increase in the percentage of unintended pregnancies that are carried to term. Guttmacher's released a couple different data sets on this. I mean, roughly in the early 1990s, about half of all unintended pregnancies were aborted. By the late 2010s, only a third of unintended pregnancies were aborted. So when women find themselves with an unintended pregnancy, they're a lot more likely to carry that pregnancy to term today than they were, say, 30 years ago. Why is this? We don't know for certain, but I think, it's a lot of it's due to pro-life efforts. I think we've made some success changing hearts and minds. We certainly have a lot more pregnancy help centers now than we did 30 years ago. I mean, there's more pregnancy help centers open today than there are abortion facilities. That's a positive trend. And since the early 90s, we've passed more pro-life laws. There are more, even prior to Dobbs. We had more states with pro-life parental involvement laws. We had more states with waiting periods. We had more states with informed consent laws that give women seeking abortions information about alternatives. So for a variety of reasons, women who do find themselves pregnant are more likely to carry those pregnancies to term. That's played a big role in the 50% decline in the abortion rate we've had since 1980.
Okay, that makes sense. And then also in your article, you mentioned that there's numerous studies that show the negative effect that contraceptive use has on like families. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I found that interesting, but that obviously wasn't like the main point of those articles, so it didn't really get fleshed out. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I just think that contraception use has just had a lot of negative impacts on the family as such. I mean, right now we have very high rates of unintended pregnancies, or I wouldn't say we have higher rates. I'd say high. I should say we see kind of increases in the number of single parent families. And I think that contraception has had a lot to do with that. As I said before, I think it's made it much easier for men to simply walk away from women they impregnate. I mean, there are many single mothers out there who do terrific work trying to raise children, but there's a good body of research that shows that children do best when they're raised by their own biological mother and biological father. And I think the fact that contraceptives are widely available encourages a lot of sexual activity before marriage and outside of marriage. And when pregnancies do happen, men face less pressure to marry. It's easier for them to simply walk away from women they impregnate. And the end result is, I just think, weaker families.
Okay, that makes sense. That it comes again back to the man just making it easier for him to just feel no responsibility for his actions. And then has anyone else been talking about this trend that's been going on? Because I know that you were writing about it. Have you seen any more research going on, or is this basically is the idea that contraception use doesn't like the contraception use increases abortion rates? Is that something that gets widely talked about, or is that something that most people just ignore? Because it seems like most
Sadly,
arguments against Opill are more about focus on women's health rather than the link to abortion.
most people just unfortunately ignore this. I'm kind of fighting a lonely battle here, trying to, sound the alarm about Opill. A lot of pro-life groups, don't really talk much about contraception. They just kind of take a neutral stance on it. I do appreciate the fact that Students for Life did have a strong statement against Opill. I appreciate that Human Life International, really is interested in trying to promote Catholic Church teachings on not only abortion, but contraception as well. And groups like American Life League have always taken a pretty strong stance against, artificial forms of contraception. The pro-life movement, I think, partly for political reasons, hasn't really spoken up much about this. So, I've been kind of fighting something of a lonely battle here. I appreciate the fact I can appear on this podcast and that I've been on some other radio shows and I have access to my Twitter account and social media platforms. But I think it is something that we need to talk about. I am glad that HLI has been fighting for this, a long time. I think that for pro-lifers to win in the end, we need to create a culture that's a lot more chaste. And I think that making contraceptives more available, especially to teenagers, does not result in a more chaste culture. It results in a more promiscuous culture. And we know that when there's a promiscuous culture, there's going to be demand for abortion, and that's very tough for us. So I think we need to engage this issue. I know that we can duck from it or hide from it. I encouraging my other pro-life friends to speak up more about it. But right now, it's been kind of a lonely battle.
And what do you see going forward? What do you think? How do you think Opill is going to affect the culture that we're dealing with going forward? Because obviously, like you said, contraception is already pretty widely available to people. Do you think this is actually going to make things worse, or do you think that things are going to remain the same?
Even though it's widely available, I mean, I do think that for teenagers, maybe reluctant to go to a medical professional or consult with their parents about it. So I do think that it may encourage contraceptive use among teenagers, and it may sadly encourage sexual activity among teenagers. We'll have to kind of wait till the data comes out. I think, from what I understand, Opill will be available in supermarkets and pharmacies around 2024. So we'll have to take a look at the data. I mean, one kind of very quiet success story we've had that gets little attention is we've gotten teen pregnancy rates down a lot, and teen sexual activity has also declined a lot. It peaked in the early 90s, but data from Youth Risk Behavior Survey and National Survey of Family Growth both show that teenagers today are less likely to engage in sexual activity than their counterparts were 30 years ago. And we really don't know why this is. I think teenagers may be a bit more risk averse because of social media platforms. It may be that teenagers just don't see themselves as marrying in the near future and don't get involved in relationships. They see marriage as something that's pretty far in the future. Maybe internet pornography, that may be playing a role as well. Again, we're not really sure, but we do have good data from multiple surveys showing substantial declines in teen sexual activity. That may reverse with Opill. I mean, we'll have data coming out, obviously, on teen pregnancies, teen abortions. Groups like, again, Youth Risk Behavior Survey and National Survey of Family Growth will be asking teens about their sexual activity. So I think we'll have some good data, and hopefully we'll be on this podcast in a few years to talk about it. I hope I'm wrong in a way. I hope that teens don't engage in sexual activity. I hope that teen abortion rates do continue to fall. But if that trend reverses itself, I will not be surprised.
Okay, I have a question that's slightly it's on topic, but it doesn't have to do as much with the contraception issue. When you said that teen sexual activity was down, is that based on data from teen pregnancies, or could the influence of more like the gay, lesbian, LGBTQ movement, could it be that there's more homosexual activity but fewer pregnancies because more teens are identifying as gay or lesbian? Could that be one of the reasons that teen pregnancies are down, or is it just teen sexual activity across the board no matter what?
Well, it's everything. First, it is teen abortions, it is teen pregnancies, and the data we have on teen sexual activity comes from surveys. Now, teenagers may not be inclined to answer honestly. People often, are understandably reluctant to, discuss or, maybe not discuss, but, answer survey questions honestly when it comes to personal matters like sex and sexual activity. So we're only kind of going on what's on surveys. Could it be that teenagers are, more likely to engage in same-sex sexual activity? Sure, that might be a role. I think there's many things kind of going on at the same time. Again, it may be that teenagers are kind of more risk averse due to social media platforms. It may be that they're able to access pornography more easily through the internet. It could be that they're just less likely involved in relationships now than they were 30 years ago. I think there's a lot of things at play. I don't think there's any one factor we've identified as the reason why teen sexual activity has declined.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I've noticed that there's been an increase among the youth, so I wasn't sure if that was playing into the data at all. So that's interesting. It's interesting if they track all three of those: abortions, pregnancies, and sexual activity. So, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers today on this subject, or anything kind of related to it?
I think again, there's just good research showing that contraceptive use and abortion rates often increase in tandem. We've seen that in the United States. Guttmacher did a study in 2003, showed that happened in Cuba, Denmark, Netherlands, Singapore, South Korea. Again, I just think once you have kind of a contraceptive mindset or that sex is kind of for recreation, not procreation, it tends to result in more unintended pregnancies, more abortions. I think Opill is going to do a lot more harm than good. I think it is going to encourage a lot more teen sexual activity, or at least enable teen sexual activity. And I think you're going to sadly end up with more unintended pregnancies and more abortions. I hope and pray that I'm wrong, but I think that's kind of the likely outcome here.
Okay. And yeah, that's unfortunate, but at least people like you are talking about it and hopefully raising awareness. So hopefully we can kind of push back against the use of contraception in our culture. So thank you so much for writing about this and talking about it and coming on the podcast to talk about it today.
Thanks, Abby. Much appreciated. And also, if any of your viewers or listeners just want to stay in touch with me, my Twitter handle is @Michael_J_new. That's @Michael_J_new. Also, on Facebook, you can reach out and friend me. Whenever I write something, I usually put it on Twitter. Sometimes I post on my Facebook page. So that's just a good way to keep up with my writing and research.
Awesome. And I can link that in the bio as well so people can find it that way. So, and to our viewers also, I mentioned an ebook at the beginning of this. I'll link that in the end screen in the description as well, so that if you're interested in more learning more about this topic, you can download that. Thank you for joining us today. To all of our listeners, please like, follow, and subscribe, share with your friends, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.